Rachel grabbed the microphone off the judge's table before I had even set down my last plate, and she said right into it, right in front of 200 people and 3 cameras, that everyone should know the truth about tonight's competition before the scores were read out. She said I had copied her signature dish from a private group chat we used to share back when we called ourselves best friends, that I had stolen her plating style, her sauce, even the name of the dish, and that she had screenshots to prove it. The room went quiet in that specific way a room gets quiet when 200 people decide at once to lean forward. My hands were still smelling like seared duck fat and thyme. My chef white still had a smear of blackberry reduction on the cuff, and I had a spot of flour dried on my wrist from the pastry work 3 hours earlier that I hadn't had time to wash off before the judging walk. And I was standing there in front of the regional final of the Golden Coast Amateur Chef Showcase, while my oldest friend held up her phone and read out messages I supposedly sent her. Messages I had never written in my life, in a voice that cracked just enough at the right moments to sound like grief instead of theater. "Read the date on that one," she said, tapping the screen for the crowd to see. 4 months ago, she asked me for my exact sauce ratio and thanked me for, quote, letting her borrow it just this once. Someone toward the back called out, "Is that real?" And another voice answered before anyone could confirm anything, "Sounds real to me." My mother, sitting in the second row in her good blue dress, put her hand over her mouth. Marcus Webb, standing just off to the side of the judging table with a scorecard still in his hand, looked from Rachel to me and back again, clearly unsure yet whether this was part of some planned segment or an actual accusation unfolding live. "Rachel, what are you doing?" I said, and my voice came out smaller than I wanted it to, thinner than I'd have liked in front of a room this size. She didn't even look at me. "I'm doing what I should have done months ago," she said, and turned back to the crowd, phone still raised like evidence at a trial. "I'm telling the truth." Behind her, one of the other finalists shifted uncomfortably in place, clearly wishing the floor would open up and swallow the moment whole, so the judging could just continue. A production assistant near the stage lights hesitated with her hand on a clipboard, unsure whether to cut to commercial or let the cameras keep rolling. And in the end, the cameras kept rolling, because moments like that one are exactly what live streams are built to catch. And I stood there holding a plate of food I had built from scratch. Food that had taken me 4 years to get right, 4 years of failed sauces and overcooked duck and recipes scrapped entirely and started over. 4 years nobody in that room had watched except the person now holding a phone up like it was a weapon. While Rachel Doyle told a room full of strangers that I was a fraud, Rachel and I had known each other since we were 9 years old, since the year her family moved in 2 doors down from mine, and she showed up at my door holding a burnt batch of cookies and asked if I wanted to fix them with her. "They're supposed to be snickerdoodles," she'd said, holding out the tray like an apology. "But I think I murdered them." We laughed so hard that day that her mother came out to check we were okay. And from that afternoon on, we cooked together nearly every weekend for the better part of 2 decades. First in her mother's kitchen, then in mine, then in culinary school where we shared a station for 3 straight semesters and split every tip we made at our first catering job right down the middle, even when one of us had clearly done more work. There was the summer we were 14 and tried to enter a county fair pie contest under fake names because we were convinced the judges played favorites and lost anyway, and laughed about it the whole drive home. There was the winter Rachel's parents split up, and she slept over at my house for 6 straight weeks. And every night we made something different for dinner because she said cooking was the only thing that made the house feel normal again. There was the graduation trip we took to Lisbon, the two of us splitting one hotel room to save money, spending entire days just wandering into random bakeries and rating the pastéis de nata on a scale we invented ourselves. There was the year I broke my wrist skiing, And Rachel showed up at my apartment every single day for 3 weeks to cook for me one-handed, alongside my one good hand, teaching me how to julienne vegetables, holding the knife in my offhand because she refused to just do it all herself and let me sit there useless. There was also, if I'm honest, a smaller memory that only made sense to me later. The night we both applied for the same regional apprenticeship under a well-known local chef. And I got it and she didn't. And she hugged me in the parking lot and told me she was happy for me. And I believed her completely at the time. We used to say we would open a restaurant together one day. Half joking, half not. And we even had a name picked out, Two Spoons, which we thought was clever at 19 and slightly embarrassing by 25. Somewhere in the last 2 years, that joke had curdled. Ever since I started getting invited to pop-up dinners she wasn't invited to. Ever since a food blogger with 60,000 followers wrote that I was, quote, the most exciting home cook working the regional circuit right now. Rachel never said she was jealous. She just started canceling on me more, started replying to my texts a day late, started introducing me to people as her friend from culinary school instead of her best friend. Once, at a mutual friend's birthday dinner, someone asked her how the restaurant idea was going, and she'd said flatly, "Oh, that's more of an Emily thing now," in a tone that made the table go quiet for a second before somebody changed the subject. Another time, at a group dinner I hosted, she spent the whole night praising every dish out loud in a voice that sounded more like a review than a compliment, the kind of praise that leaves a faint bruise behind it. She also started, in the last few months especially, asking oddly specific questions about my schedule, which competitions I was entering next, who I was talking to in the food world. Questions that felt at the time like ordinary curiosity between friends, and only made sense afterward as reconnaissance. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself people get busy, people get insecure sometimes, and it passes. What I did not tell myself, because I did not know it yet, was that she had spent the last 3 months building a story, one slow drip at a time, designed to detonate in exactly this room on exactly this night, in front of exactly this audience. Because this was the night the regional final would be live streamed to 11,000 people who followed the competition page, and Rachel Doyle had never once done anything without an audience in mind. What Rachel did not know, what almost nobody outside my own kitchen knew, was that 6 weeks earlier, a literary agent named Priya Shah had emailed me out of nowhere after finding my food blog, the quiet little thing I updated maybe once a month with recipes and stories about my grandmother's kitchen in Marseille, and asked if I had ever thought about turning it into a book. "I don't say this lightly," she wrote, "but I haven't read a food voice this specific in years." I wrote back thinking nothing would come of it, half convinced it was some kind of scam, and spent an evening searching her name to make sure the agency was real before I even replied properly. Over 3 sleepless weeks, I put together 40 pages, half memoir and half recipe collection, writing most of it after midnight at that same kitchen table, and sent it to her mostly to be polite, expecting a kind rejection within a month. 2 days before the regional final, Priya called me at 9 at night, and I almost didn't pick up because I assumed it was bad news dressed up as a courtesy call. "Sit down," she said, and I told her I was already sitting, and she said, "Good, because a publisher wants to buy this, and they want to move fast." She named a number for the advance that made me put the phone down on the counter for a second just to breathe, and when I picked it back up, she was still talking, laughing a little at my silence. "They're talking spring release," she added, "and a real marketing push. They're calling you an undiscovered voice. Their words, not mine, though I happen to agree." I asked her stupidly if she was sure they meant me and not some other Emily, and she laughed again and said there was only one Emily whose grandmother's blackberry reduction recipe had made her cry at her desk, and that the acquisitions editor had specifically asked whether I'd be willing to do a short author photo shoot in an actual working kitchen rather than a studio, because the whole pitch hinged on the fact that none of this was staged. I told her I'd have to think about the photo shoot, mostly because I couldn't picture myself standing still for a camera without immediately wanting to fix something on the counter behind me. And she laughed and said that instinct alone was probably exactly why the publisher wanted me in the first place. I hadn't told anyone. Not my mother, not my roommate, not even the chef who mentored me through culinary school. I wanted to hold it close for a little while longer, to have one thing in my life that was mine before the internet got its hands on it. I certainly hadn't told Rachel, because for months now, telling Rachel good news about my cooking had started to feel like handing someone a knife and asking them to hold it very still while you leaned in close. And some quiet, cautious part of me had already stopped trusting her with things that mattered. The head judge, a soft-spoken man named Marcus Webb, who had run 3 Michelin kitchens before he retired into teaching, held up a hand and asked Rachel to lower the phone and let the judging panel address this properly rather than litigating it live on stage. But by then, the damage had already been done. The clip was already being recorded by 40 phones in the audience, and Rachel wasn't finished. I tried to reach out privately, she said, still holding the microphone. I begged her for months to just admit what she'd done. And I'm only doing this now because I can't in good conscience watch her win a competition built on a lie. Her voice cracked again on the word lie. I loved her like a sister, she said, and she took the one thing that was supposed to be ours and made it hers. A woman 2 tables back actually said, out loud, "That's so sad." And I felt something close to laughter rise up in my chest. The wrong kind of laughter. The kind that comes right before you either cry or say something you can't take back. Instead, I set my plate down very carefully on the judging table, the way you set something down when your hands are shaking and you don't want anyone to see it. And I asked for the microphone. Marcus hesitated, glanced at the producer standing off to the side of the stage, and finally handed it over. I don't know what those messages are, I said, but I know I didn't write them. And I think there's a way to prove that instead of just saying it back and forth all night. Rachel folded her arms. Prove it then, she said, and the crowd made a sound somewhere between a murmur and a dare. Marcus organized what he called a proper hearing, rather than let the moment die out on its own, because the clip had already gone up on 3 different accounts within 20 minutes, and the competition's own social media team was getting flooded with comments. And he decided, reasonably, that the fairest thing to do was hold an actual public review the following week. Streamed the same way, where both of us could present our case with actual evidence rather than a phone held up to a crowd. I think he believed this would protect me. I think he genuinely believed a calm, structured, evidence-based hearing would let the truth win out on its own terms. What he did not realize was that Rachel had spent 3 months building toward that exact kind of moment, that she had rehearsed which screenshots to show and in which order, that she had recruited 2 mutual acquaintances from culinary school to testify that they'd, quote, always suspected something was off between us, and that she intended to use the week before the hearing to make sure as many people as possible had already decided I was guilty before a single piece of evidence was shown. She texted people. She posted vague, sad little captions about loyalty and betrayal under photos of the two of us from years ago. One, an old picture from the Lisbon trip with a caption about people who forget where they came from. She did an interview with a small food podcast where she never said my name directly, but described me in enough detail that everyone knew exactly who she meant, telling the host, "Some people just take and call it inspiration." A cooking forum I used to post in occasionally started a thread debating whether I should be banned from posting there at all. And somebody I'd never met wrote 3 paragraphs about how they'd always found my recipes, quote, "a little too polished to be original," which stung in a way I hadn't expected from a stranger. My phone buzzed constantly that week with messages from acquaintances who claimed to be checking in on me, but clearly just wanted details. And I stopped answering most of them because I couldn't tell anymore who actually cared and who just wanted a front row seat. One former classmate I hadn't spoken to in 3 years sent a long message that started with, "I hope you're okay," and ended 4 paragraphs later with a not so subtle request for my side of the story. She could, quote, "share responsibly." My roommate started screening my calls for me by the 3rd day, holding up my phone with a raised eyebrow and mouthing the word no before I even had to ask. I stopped checking the cooking forum entirely after the 2nd day, not because I didn't care what strangers thought, but because I realized somewhere around midnight on day 3 that reading it wasn't preparation. It was just a slower, more private version of standing in that banquet hall all over again. By the time the hearing rolled around, half the food scene in 3 counties had already made up their minds, and I was the villain in a story I hadn't written and didn't recognize. In the middle of that terrible week, almost as if the universe needed to remind me that other people's lives kept moving, whether mine had stalled out or not. My younger brother called to tell me his daughter had been hospitalized overnight with a bad fever that turned out to be nothing more than a stubborn ear infection. And for 6 hours, I sat in a different hospital waiting room than the one I'd expected to be worrying about that month, texting my mother updates while she paced her kitchen 2 towns over, both of us temporarily forgetting Rachel existed at all. The waiting room had one of those televisions bolted high in the corner, playing a cooking show rerun with the sound off, and I remember staring at it for a long time without really watching it, just grateful for something on a screen that wasn't a comment section. A different family sat 2 rows over, a father bouncing a toddler on his knee, and for a while I found myself watching them instead, envying, in a strange, detached way, how uncomplicated their worry looked next to mine. My brother kept apologizing for pulling me away during, quote, "my whole thing," and I told him honestly that it was the first time in a week I hadn't felt like I was being watched. A nurse came out around midnight and told us the fever had broken, and it was almost certainly just the ear infection doing its worst before the medication caught up. And my niece, half asleep in a hospital gown 2 sizes too big, opened one eye and asked if I'd brought her any of the fancy competition food, which made my brother laugh for the first time all night. It was a strange kind of relief, being reminded that the world was bigger than one banquet hall and one phone held up in anger. When I finally drove home that night, exhausted in the particular way that comes from being scared for someone else instead of yourself for a while, I found 3 more messages waiting from acquaintances asking if the rumors were true. And the smaller world came rushing back in to fill the space the hospital waiting room had briefly cleared. The night before the hearing, my mother sat with me at my kitchen table, the same table Rachel and I used to do our homework at as kids, and she asked me if I wanted her to come, and I said yes. And she asked me if I was scared, and I told her the truth, which was that I wasn't scared of losing the competition. I was scared of losing the story of who I was before I even got the chance to tell it. She reached across the table and held my hand and said something my grandmother used to say, that the truth doesn't need to shout, it just needs a place to stand. And then she asked me, carefully, gently, whether there was anything else going on, anything I hadn't told her, because she'd noticed I'd been strange and quiet for weeks, in a way that felt different from just being upset about Rachel. I almost told her about the book right there. I almost said, actually, there's this whole other thing, this whole other life waiting on the other side of all this noise. But something in me wanted to save it, wanted one true and untouched piece of good news for after. So I just told her I loved her and went to bed and didn't sleep much at all. I lay there staring at the ceiling, running through every version of the next day I could imagine. The ones where I won, and the ones where nobody believed me no matter what evidence I brought. And somewhere around 3 in the morning, I got up and reread the export I'd already downloaded on my laptop, just to make sure it still said what I remembered it saying. As if it might have changed overnight, the way everything else in my life seemed to be changing without my permission. The hearing happened on a Thursday evening in the same banquet hall, with the same cameras, except this time there were twice as many people. Because word had spread and because a hearing billed as a Food World scandal draws a very particular kind of crowd. The competition had set up a proper panel table this time, 3 folding chairs behind a strip of white cloth, with Marcus in the center flanked by 2 other judges I recognized from earlier rounds, and a small screen and projector had been wheeled in specifically for the evidence portion, the kind of setup that made the whole thing feel less like a cooking show and more like something out of a courtroom drama. Marcus opened by explaining the format, that both parties would present evidence, and the panel would rule based on facts rather than testimony alone, and reminded the room, somewhat futilely given the size of the crowd, that this was still meant to be a respectful process. Rachel went first, because she was the one who'd made the accusation, and she walked to the podium in a blazer I didn't recognize, the kind of outfit you buy specifically for a moment like this one. She pulled up screenshots on a projector, a whole conversation thread supposedly between us, messages where I apparently asked her for her sauce ratio and her plating notes and thanked her for, quote, letting me borrow the idea just this once. The messages looked real. They had my name on them, my old profile photo, timestamps going back 4 months. A gasp went through the crowd again. My mother's hand found mine under the table and gripped it hard. Rachel then brought up her 2 witnesses from culinary school, a man named Julian Ford and a woman named Bia Alvarez, who each said, in careful rehearsed sentences, that they'd noticed similarities between my dishes and Rachel's over the past year, and had, quote, always wondered. I didn't want to say anything, Julian told the panel, but once Rachel brought it up, it made a lot of sense. Bea nodded along beside him, arms crossed, not quite meeting my eyes. I asked for a short recess before my turn, and Marcus granted it. 10 minutes that felt like 10 seconds and 10 hours at the same time. And I called Priya from the hallway, with my heart going so fast I could feel it in my ears, because I needed her permission to reveal something that wasn't fully mine to reveal yet. I found a corner near the coat check where the noise of the crowd dropped to a low hum, and my hands were shaking hard enough that I had to steady the phone against my ear with my other hand. Priya, I might need to bring up the book tonight, I told her. Not the deal itself. Just enough to prove something? Is that allowed? She didn't hesitate, and I could hear in the pause before she spoke that she'd already guessed something like this might happen eventually, from the fragments I'd told her about Rachel over the past few weeks. If it stops a public character assassination, she said, I would rather you use it now than protect a marketing timeline. Do what you need to do. And Emily, she added, you didn't do anything wrong. Remember that walking back in there? When I walked back into that hall, I didn't say a word about the book yet. I started instead with the messages themselves, because I'd spent the recess doing something Rachel apparently hadn't expected me to think of, which was calling the messaging app's support line and requesting an official data export of my own account history. The kind of export that comes with server-side metadata and can't be edited after the fact the way a screenshot can. "I'd like to walk everyone through this together," I said, and asked the panel's technical advisor, a young man from the competition's IT sponsor, who introduced himself as Theo and looked barely older than the college students in the audience, to pull up my official export live on the projector next to Rachel's screenshots. "Look at the date on hers," I said, pointing. 4 months ago. Now, look at mine. Same date, same account, straight from the company's own servers. Where her screenshots showed a conversation between us dated 4 months ago, my official export showed no such conversation existed on my account at all on those dates. "That's not possible," Rachel said quickly. "I have the actual messages saved." And I said calmly, "Then let's look at where they came from." What the export showed instead, buried 3 weeks earlier in a completely different thread, was Rachel asking a mutual friend, in a message she apparently forgot was backed up to a shared family plan account that friends still used, whether it was, quote, "possible to make old texts look like they came from someone else if you had the right screenshot template." The technical advisor read the message aloud, slowly, so there could be no mistaking it. And the room did not gasp this time. The room went very, very still, the kind of still where you can hear the air conditioning. "That message could mean anything," Rachel said. "Too fast. People ask weird hypothetical questions all the time." I asked her gently whether she often asked friends hypothetical questions about faking screenshots 3 weeks before accusing someone of theft on livestream, and she didn't answer that one. I asked the technical advisor to also pull the account creation and device history logs, which showed my messaging account had been active on the same phone, my phone, for 3 straight years with no gaps and no unusual login locations. While a forensic examiner the competition brought in on my request confirmed that the font kerning and interface elements in Rachel's screenshots matched an older version of the app that had been discontinued 8 months before the supposed conversation ever happened. "So the messages she's showing you," the examiner told the panel, "could not have been generated by the app in its current form on that date. It's not an opinion, it's a technical impossibility." Rachel tried once more, arguing that phones update automatically, and maybe her old messages just displayed in an outdated style, and the examiner shook his head and explained, patiently, that the interface elements don't retroactively change once a conversation exists. Only the app version at the time of sending determines how it looks, and hers matched a version she hadn't had installed in 8 months. She tried a third excuse after that, quieter this time, suggesting maybe she'd exported the messages from an old backup on a different device. And Theo, still standing at the projector, pulled up one more screen showing that the account in question had only ever been registered to a single device, hers, with no backups restored from anywhere else in the time frame she was describing. Each excuse she offered seemed to shrink a little smaller than the one before it, and by the third one, even the people in the crowd who'd been loudest in her defense a week earlier had gone quiet. Marcus turned to Julian Ford and asked him directly whether Rachel had approached him or he had approached her. And after a long pause, Julian admitted she had messaged him first, 3 days before the original outburst at the competition, and had, quote, walked him through what she needed him to remember. B. Alvarez didn't even wait to be asked. She stood up in the crowd, visibly uncomfortable, and said she wanted to withdraw her statement, that Rachel had told her this was just going to be a private conversation to clear the air, and she hadn't realized it would become this. Rachel stood at the front of the room with her mouth slightly open, and for the first time in the whole ordeal, she didn't have a prepared line. "This is insane," she finally said. "You're twisting this. You're always twisting things." I told her calmly that I wasn't twisting anything, that the servers didn't have opinions, that the timestamps didn't have grudges, and that everything on that screen was simply what had actually happened. It was around then that a woman near the front, one of the competition's longtime volunteers, a heavy-set woman named Grace, who'd been running the check-in table at every regional event for as long as I'd been competing, quietly mentioned to Marcus that she'd noticed Rachel visiting the venue twice in the week before the original incident, once during a technical setup day when contestants weren't supposed to be present, and asked whether anyone had checked whether Rachel had accessed the shared prep kitchen, where contestant recipe cards were stored overnight. Marcus asked the venue for their internal security footage, and it turned out the venue kept it for exactly this kind of dispute, stored on a server the event's coordinator could pull up from a laptop at the side of the stage. There was a strange, suspended few minutes while everyone waited for the file to load, the whole room sitting in a silence that had nothing performative left in it, just genuine uncertainty about what was about to appear on screen. And I remember Marcus tapping his pen against the table in a slow rhythm, the only sound in the whole hall besides the low hum of the projector fan. The footage showed Rachel, 2 nights before the competition, alone in the prep kitchen at 11 at night, photographing the recipe card I had submitted in advance for judging, the one with my exact sauce ratio written in my own handwriting, the same ratio she'd later claimed I had stolen from her. Marcus paused the footage on the frame where her phone flash caught the corner of the card and asked her quietly if she had anything to say. She didn't answer. She just stared at the screen like she was watching herself from the outside for the first time. And somewhere behind me, I heard someone in the crowd whisper, "That's her. That's actually her." As if part of them hadn't believed any of it would turn out to be true until they saw her own face doing it. Word of what was happening in that hall had by this point spread far beyond the room itself, because the stream was still running, and the comment section had turned entirely on its head in the space of about 20 minutes. The same people who had called me a fraud a week earlier, now flooding the chat with apologies and outrage on my behalf. The competition's organizing board called for a short private session with Rachel afterward, and word came back through Marcus a few days later that she had been formally disqualified from the circuit for the season, with a note attached to her file that would follow her if she ever applied to compete again. 2 culinary programs she'd been quietly angling to teach at. One, a well-regarded community college, and the other, a private cooking academy that ran a popular weekend series, were informed of the footage independently by other attendees who'd been in the room, and both rescinded their interest within the same week. One of them sending a curt 2-line email that simply said, "See, the timing wasn't right anymore." The food blog that had originally amplified her accusations, the one with 60,000 followers, issued a formal retraction along with an apology for not verifying anything before publishing, and quietly deleted 3 follow-up posts that had speculated further about my supposed dishonesty. The small podcast that had run the vague interview episode pulled it from their feed entirely within 48 hours, replacing it with a short statement about editorial standards that didn't mention Rachel by name, but didn't need to. Julian Ford posted his own short apology to me privately, admitting he'd let a 20-year friendship with Rachel cloud his judgment, though he never said anything publicly, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that he'd already stepped back from the culinary school's alumni committee out of what he called simple embarrassment. B. Alvarez, for her part, reached out to Marcus directly to ask whether there was any way to formally correct the record with the competition, and he told her the retraction from the stage had already done most of that work, though she still sent me a private message a few days later that just said simply, "I should have asked more questions before I agreed to say anything. I'm sorry." Even the venue itself sent a short note through Grace saying they'd be keeping their security footage retention policy in place a while longer, given, in her words, how useful it had turned out to be. None of it happened because I asked for it. It happened because once real evidence enters a room, the room tends to rearrange itself around it, whether you push or not. Rachel called me 2 weeks later, on a Sunday afternoon, her voice small in a way I hadn't heard from her since we were teenagers. "I'm not calling to ask you to forgive me," she said. "I just needed you to hear me say it. I'm sorry. I don't even fully understand why I did it. Watching you succeed just started to feel like watching a door close on my own life, and I let that feeling turn into something ugly." There was a long pause on the line, long enough that I almost thought the call had dropped, before she added quieter, "I keep thinking about the fair pie contest when we were 14, and I don't know how we got from there to here." She told me she'd taken a job doing prep work at a small diner 2 towns over. Nothing public-facing, nothing that would put her name anywhere near a stage again for a long while, and that her mother had suggested she talk to someone, an actual therapist, about why watching someone else's happiness had felt so unbearable, and that she'd finally agreed to go. I let her finish. Then I told her that I understood jealousy, that I had felt it too at different points in my life, and never once turned it into a weapon aimed at someone I loved, and that what I couldn't get past wasn't the jealousy itself, but the 3 months of quiet planning underneath it. The messages, the footage, the recruited witnesses, all of it built with intention rather than heat of the moment. I'm not angry anymore, I told her, but I don't think there's a version of us left to fix. She didn't argue. I figured you'd say that, she said quietly, and I think some part of her had already known it before she dialed. We stayed on the line a few seconds longer than the conversation needed, neither of us quite ready to be the one who hung up first. And then she said goodbye, and I said goodbye, and that was the last time we spoke. My mother made dinner that Sunday night, the same duck dish from the original competition, and my younger brother came over with his kids. And for a few hours, nobody talked about Rachel or the hearing or any of it. We just ate and argued about a card game and let the kitchen smell like something good again instead of something under a microscope. My niece, fully recovered from her ear infection and thoroughly unimpressed by adult drama, informed the table that my duck was, quote, better than the hospital jello, which everyone agreed was the highest praise available. My mother kept getting up to refill glasses that weren't empty yet, the way she does when she's happy and doesn't quite know what to do with her hands. And at one point she caught my eye across the table and just smiled. A small, private smile that said more than anything either of us could have put into words about the last 2 months. My brother's oldest, 12 and permanently unimpressed by everyone, asked at one point whether Rachel was, quote, actually a bad person or just a jealous one. And the table went quiet for a second before my mother said gently that people can do bad things without being bad people forever. And that didn't mean you owed them your kitchen table back. It was over dessert that I finally told them about the book, that a publisher had bought it, that it would be on shelves by spring. And my mother put down her spoon and cried in the good way, the way you cry when something you've been quietly hoping for finally arrives. Why didn't you tell us sooner? She asked, laughing through it, wiping her eyes with the back of her wrist. And I said I'd wanted one good thing that was just mine for a little while before the world got involved. My brother made me promise the first signed copy was his, and made me swear a second promise too, that I'd put the duck recipe in it exactly as is. No substitutions, no fancy restaurant plating notes, just the way our mother taught me. His daughter, only half listening by then, asked if there would be a picture of her in the book, and I told her there absolutely would be, right next to the Jell-O joke. It was the first time in almost 2 months that the biggest thing in the room was something happy instead of something I had to defend. The final twist came about 10 days later, in an email from Priya that started with the word "so" and a lot of exclamation points, telling me that a regional television producer had seen the clip of the hearing, the one where the footage played and the room went quiet, and wanted to option my story. Not the book exactly, but the whole arc of it, the friendship, the betrayal, the evidence, the fallout, for a short documentary segment on a Rising Voices in Food Media series. I called her back within the hour, still standing in my kitchen in an apron I hadn't taken off since lunch. They want to film in my actual kitchen, I said, half laughing, half stunned, pacing a little circle by the stove, and she said, "Get used to that feeling. It's going to happen a lot this year." I asked her a dozen half-formed questions in a row, whether they'd want to talk to my mother, whether Rachel's name would come up at all, whether I'd have any say in how the story got framed, and Priya patiently walked through each one, promising we'd go through every detail of the contract together before I signed anything. There was one more detail buried near the bottom of her email that I almost missed on the first read. A mention that the producers team had also reached out, separately, to Marcus Webb, asking whether he'd be willing to appear on camera describing what it was like to run that hearing, and that he'd apparently agreed on the condition that the segment focus on the evidence itself rather than turning either of us into a spectacle, which felt like exactly the kind of thing Marcus would insist on. Even Grace, the volunteer who'd first mentioned the venue footage, got a small note of thanks from the production team asking if she'd be willing to describe, briefly, what those two visits from Rachel had looked like from the check-in table. And she told me over the phone a few days later that she'd agreed, mostly, she said, because somebody should be able to say out loud that they noticed something was wrong before it became a whole hearing. I said yes before I even finished reading the email twice. Somewhere underneath the excitement was a strange, unexpected ache, because it meant the worst 3 months of my adult life were about to become the thing most people knew me for, at least for a little while, before the food itself got a chance to speak for me the way I'd always wanted it to. I sat with that feeling for a long time that night, turning it over the way you'd turn over a dish that came out almost right, but not quite, and decided I could live with it because, at least this time, the story being told about me would be true. So here's what I keep coming back to. Whenever I think about that night under the competition lights with a microphone pointed at my face and a room full of strangers deciding in real time who to believe, I think about how close it came to going the other way. How easily a room can decide someone is guilty before a single piece of real evidence ever shows up, just because the accusation arrived first and louder. If someone you've loved for 20 years decided one day that your success was a personal insult to them, would you have known it was coming, or would it have taken you completely by surprise the way it did me? If you like this story, tell me in the comments what you would have done in that hearing room. And if you want more stories like this one, hit subscribe because there's always another one waiting.